everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining today's launch webinar for the project Pathways to Zero Impact Shipping. My name is Clara Kaufman. I'm the research manager at ClearSeas, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. ClearSeas is an independent, non-for-profit research center that supports informed decision-making about marine shipping in Canada. We do this by sharing objective, evidence-based information about the role of marine shipping in our economy, society, as well as its environmental and community impacts. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Montreal, located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. ClearSea's work takes place across many Indigenous lands and waters, and we recognize the enduring relationships that Indigenous peoples have with these places. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registrants after the session. We will begin with a presentation, followed by a moderated panel discussion, and then we'll move into audience questions. During the presentation and panel, please feel free to submit questions in the chat at any time. We'll save most questions for the Q&A period at the end. When we get to that portion, you're welcome to raise your hand and turn on your camera and microphone to ask your question directly, or you can continue to add questions to the chat and I'll read them out on your behalf. So today's webinar explores findings from this project, which is a collaboration between ClearSeas, the National Research Council of Canada, and the University of British Columbia. The discussion will focus on how structured decision-making approaches can help stakeholders navigate competing objectives and make more informed choices about the future of marine shipping. We are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Simone Philpott, the research lead and postdoctoral fellow, Marie-Chantal Ross from the National Research Council of Canada, and Dr. Amanda Jang, principal investigator at the University of British Columbia. With that, I'll now turn things over to Simone to begin the presentation. So I'll just share the slides.
Thanks so much for getting that up. Before I get started into our project, in the interest of full transparency, I just want to mention that two team members that have interests that could be interpreted as raising questions about conflicts of interest. So first, one of our team members' partner is an employee for a company that manufactures energy storage solutions for the maritime industry. And I'm mentioning this because the research project addressed technology decision-making in the shipping industry, which could at times include factors relevant to battery storage. Now, we wanted to be transparent about this, even though the work didn't really focus on batteries manufactured by any particular company or have any significance for the firm in question. Now, also, throughout the research, I'll be mentioning several tools that we used in our research, and one of those is Strategy Finder. So I'm now affiliated with the team that developed one of those tools. That affiliation began after I had completed my role in the study, so I was not affiliated with it during the research phase that involved deciding among decision support tools or deploying them. Now, we don't actually anticipate that either situation contributed to any conflicts of interest, but we do want to be transparent about them. So with that covered, I just want to thank you all for joining us, and now we can dig into our project. Slide. So as Claire mentioned, this project collaboration, including ClearSeas, UBC, and the National Research Council of Canada. And also, I do want to mention that from UBC, we included and benefited from several very talented student researchers throughout the project. And you can see their names listed to the right there. Now, what were we working on? So marine shipping is one of the most efficient ways to move goods. But as shipping activity grows, so do concerns around the environmental impacts from vessels, from greenhouse gases and air pollution to underwater radiated noise and water quality, right? So decision makers are increasingly being asked to meet a wide range of environmental targets and often being asked to meet them simultaneously. At the same time, they're being presented with a growing and complicated menu of technology and fuel options. And while many of the technologies and fuel options are promising, none is really a clear winner across all the dimensions that matter. And they all offer really important trade-offs. Those trade-offs are wide-ranging and very consequential. And while industry is quite experienced at certain methods of decision-making, like cost-benefit analysis, that toolkit alone just really doesn't meet these types of challenges. So in this context, we asked ourselves, like for this research, how can we help decision makers navigate these trade-offs and these decision complicators more systematically? Now, I talked a bit about trade-offs there, and I want to make that trade-off problem a little bit more concrete. So we'll just take a minute to consider a real example that we looked at during the scoping phase of our research. And that was when we did an analysis of decision-making around sulfur regulation. So this is really just sort of a illustrative example of the types of problems that really interest us here. So traditional marine fuels like heavy fuel oil, they have a high sulfur content. When they're burned, they release sulfur oxides, which are pollutants, and they're linked to respiratory and cardiovascular harms, particulate matter formation, and a wide range of other harms. So the IMO responded with IMO 2020. This was a policy cutting the allowable sulfur content of fuels outside of emission control areas from 3.5 to 0.5%. Now, vessel operators basically had two main routes to compliance. Switch to lower sulfur fuels or install scrubbers. These are devices that remove sulfur from exhaust before it enters the atmosphere. The number of vessels then with scrubbers then grew significantly, and that's where a really important trade-off emerged. I mean, scrubbers work. They reduce air emissions of sulfur. But most of those being installed were open loop systems, and this meant that the contaminated wash water being produced by the process was discharged directly into the ocean. So you're turning air pollution into water pollution. So this policy, this regulation, it succeeded in its own narrow terms around air quality, while creating a new problem, which was water pollution, right? The lesson here isn't that scrubbers are bad, but it's that when a decision context isn't analyzed across the full system, across what you really want to achieve, then risks and burdens can be shifted in ways that really aren't captured by even the most well-intentioned policies or choices. And that's the kind of, not the only, but that's sort of an illustrative example of the kind of problems that make decision-making hard, right? So with that context in mind, here's a quick bird's eye view of what we did to address these types of challenges, our contribution here in the Pathways to Zero Impact Shipping project. So our core goal was to develop an evaluative framework that was fit for purpose for marine shipping professionals, one that supports more holistic, comprehensive assessments of the environmental impacts that marine technologies and fuels can bring. Now, I should specify what we were not doing was we were not picking winners in technologies or fuels. We were looking to identify best practices and techniques for comprehensive evaluation of alternatives, whatever they may be, today and in the future. So to start, we conducted a scoping study, which included desktop research and stakeholder interviews. Now, parts of those desktop study were used to conduct a game theory analysis of that sulfur policy that I spoke about a moment ago, and parts of the scoping research were developed into a report by Dillon ABL Consultants and the UBC and ClearSeas team members. And this was the Ship Design and Technologies to Reduce Environmental Impacts report. For this report, we interviewed industry professionals to understand how decisions are currently made and what gets in the way of adopting greener technologies. And we also that work also produced a catalog of existing impact reduction technologies. Then we engaged directly with maritime stakeholders to co-develop and test a decision support framework through two case studies. The first one with the Canadian Coast Guard and the second with the National Research Council of Canada's Ocean Program. These two case studies were deliberately chosen to be quite different from one another because we wanted what we learned to be more generalizable across the sector and adaptable rather than specific to one type of decision or organization. Now, before moving into the decision support framework itself, I want to share a little bit about what we learned in preparing the Ship Design and Technologies to Reduce Environmental Impact report. On the technology side, the review covered a wide range of available technology options and design options like hydrodynamic improvements, propulsion technologies, aerodynamic enhancements. But on the decision-making side, the interview revealed that cost and regulatory compliance are driving technology adoption, which makes sense in a competitive environment. Environmental impact reduction can be difficult to prioritize if it's not captured in existing regulations. We found that the need for quality and highly trusted performance data and regulatory certainty, these came through as gaps that can limit the uptake of greener options. And this is really an area where government and academia could make a difference by closing some of those knowledge gaps. We also found an acknowledgement or a concern that technology decisions do need to be made early, which can be challenging when there's changing technologies and a wide suite to choose from. But it's important because once a contract is signed, making changes can become costly and sometimes prohibitive. And finally, one that I found particularly interesting, the research indicated that decision support, it really isn't being leveraged to its potential. So models and simulations are being used for specific purposes, but really nothing that encompasses the decision support in a really integrated way. And this surprised me a bit because the field of decision analysis is dedicated and grew up around the kinds of difficult, complex, and high stakes decisions that maritime shipping is facing right now. It really struck me as a missed opportunity, both for people in the maritime shipping who I believe could benefit from decision support and decision analysis techniques, but also for the decision analysts, these professionals who could be working in such a fascinating and important sector. So with those observations in hand, we set out to develop and pilot some decision support, a decision support framework specifically for maritime shipping. Now, given my contention that decision support is well positioned to contribute to maritime shipping, I think it warrants taking a moment to think about what that could look like. So in envisioning it, we brought in an approach called structured decision making. And this is a well-established approach for guiding decisions in decision analysis. And we complemented it with systems tools from systems thinking, which takes in holistic and captures interactions among interacting components of systems. So to understand what this adds, it helps to start with a concrete comparison of what's already sort of conventionally in use. So for one example, we can think about vessel design, which in the maritime sector conventionally follows what's called the design spiral. You can see it in the top right corner of this slide. This is an iterative process in which the vessel design moves through successive rounds of refinement where different experts contribute their knowledge sequentially. And each expert can ensure that the design satisfies their constraints before passing it along, with options for or opportunities for iteration. This is extremely useful, but when experts engage at separate stages, each optimizing for their own area of concern, trade-offs between those areas can go unseen, or different interpretations of them can go unseen. So the expertise is there, but it's not in dialogue. Now, this is where structured decision-making offers something special. The 6 steps that you see going across the slide here, these mirror the logic that a good structured decision-making process would follow. And it also brings the people engaged in the decision together when they have different goals, roles, and knowledge. It brings them into direct conversation at each stage. So this creates opportunities to not only develop a shared set of objectives, but to ensure that those objectives are actually understood and prioritized in the same way from those different experts and people involved in the decision. And it also surfaces trade-offs early when there's still room to address them. So you don't end up with pathway dependencies that are unexpected or unintended. So during our project, we spent a lot of time on the problem structuring phase because it is critical to the success of every step that follows. That's where you get that common understanding of the decision. We also integrated the use of systems methods, systems techniques that help people to visualize and communicate how technologies or decisions interact with the environment and with each other. Now, our framework isn't meant to be a rigid prescription, but to be a guide that can be adapted to meet the complexity and stakes of any decision at hand. So we'll go, yeah. Structured decision making, as I said, it needs to be flexible. It's not a single method. It's a flexible approach that can be implemented using a wide range of tools. And we tried several different tools throughout this project. We started with a hybrid workshop, by which I mean it was an in-person workshop that also had online components. So bringing together people to structure their problems, surface objectives, and build a shared understanding of how they see the problem. And this really ensures that you're not just finding the right answer to the wrong problem, as well as making sure you're understanding every step as you go along. So we used this method in the Canadian Coast Guard case study, where participants were able to join us in person or online. These sessions really allowed for real-time dialogue and validation across expertise. And you can see a little sample of some of the in-person material we had here with those sticky notes on the slide. We also use Strategy Finder, which I mentioned earlier. This is a software tool designed for online collaborative decision-making. It allows participants to build cognitive maps So representations of how different factors and goals in a system are causally connected. We then use those maps to encourage and document and structure group conversations. We use AltaViz. This is a multiple criteria decision support software developed by Compass Resource Management. We used it in the Canadian Coast Guard study. It guides online users through structured decision-making steps and includes methods for eliciting people's preferences as well as their knowledge. Now, one important consideration arose here, which was that around data sovereignty, because while the software was developed in Vancouver by a Vancouver consultancy, it does use American servers, and that could raise data sovereignty concerns. Now, our workshops use publicly available information, but this would be a real consideration for organizations dealing with sensitive or proprietary data. So that's why we then developed an Excel-based tool for our NRC, or National Research Council of Canada case study, really to demonstrate one way to implement a similar process, something that still captures those best practices, but using a more widely accessible software that has local hosting. And then finally, the last one you see listed there, cross-impact balances, which we used briefly at the start of the study. This is a scenario building method. We applied it to a subset of study data. And it is really well suited to complex systems analysis, but we did find it wasn't quite at the time user-friendly enough to integrate into our workshops. Now, taken together, it's a bit of a laundry list here, but when you take it all together, I guess the takeaway here is that these tools really can show that some of the range of what's available. And I think also the importance of matching the tool to the context. So while analytic power is important, you want to know what kind of analysis you're able to do with your tools you're using when you're making a decision. It's also really important that the people using it are comfortable with the technology, that it meets your data security needs and your budget and timing needs. So hopefully this, when you look at the report, you'll see that there's a wide range of options, and this is really just a sample of them. So there's even more to come. Now, to test and develop the framework we're developing, we ran 2 case studies. They were chosen to be of interest to our collaborators and to represent different types of decisions. So we knew that structured decision-making activities require a grounded and specific decision problem. So if you don't have that, the conversations don't really have enough constraints and direction. So we started off by asking what kind of decision problems are of interest that would help our participants to be invested in the process. And with the Canadian Coast Guard, we ended up looking at vessel design considerations. And our scoping interviews indicated that a case study built around a hypothetical program icebreaker, that fleet would be interesting and useful as an illustrative example. So we worked with Coast Guard professionals in evaluating technology and fuel options for near to midterm adoption for that type of vessel. The second case study with the National Research Council of Canada's Ocean Program, for that one, our case study was to evaluate competing research proposals, so the program needs to evaluate these competing research proposals. So we developed a set of key performance indicators within a decision support framework to help guide those evaluations. And together, these very different case studies sort of made the case that decision support is not just useful for one type of decision, but can be adapted to handle very different situations, all of which are relevant to maritime shipping. Now, the Coast Guard, I'll just talk about that a little bit. It was structured around a central question, which was how can environmental, operational, economic, and technical considerations be evaluated together when exploring design and technology options? And again, in our example of the program icebreaker. After scoping interviews, we addressed this question with 2 workshops. The first one was really focused on problem structuring. That's the one that was delivered in the hybrid format, so in-person, online, and brought together a wide range of professionals from different roles to work through the types of decisions together. We used physical boards and sticky notes and guided conversations and had proxy facilitators so that people who were online could contribute as well. During that workshop, we elicited from the group their real key objectives, their concerns, and the types of performance indicators that they would consider to be valid around technology and design alternatives for this hypothetical decision. After that, we used the workshop outputs to guide a preliminary performance assessment of a set of fuel alternatives against those objectives that the group had identified. And then we held a second workshop, which was about eliciting preferences and trying to understand what drives those preferences. For that, we used the AltaViz software, and our participants explored how the different alternatives that we were looking at performed across the objectives they had generated. And then we started to explore their preferences using different methods. What we found was that there was no dominant technological winner. Preferences varied across participants. And this probably reflected their different professional roles, as well as some very real uncertainty around the performance of those alternatives. Now, when you read the report, the preferences documented should be interpreted with caution because the case study was designed as an illustrative exercise, not a definitive comparison. And knowing that it was hypothetical, participants may have considered or even played with perspectives they wouldn't normally consider when they were making a very high stakes decision. Personally, I don't see this as a limitation. I actually see it as just one more way that these types of activities can contribute to good decision making, right? It's an opportunity to consider opinions you may not hold while there's mimicking real constraints, but actually not having high stakes in the exercise. So that was our Coast Guard, and then we'll move on to the NRC. And as I mentioned before, the NRC case study addressed a very different kind of decision. So this was how can maritime research and development proposals be evaluated and compared across environmental, social, economic, and strategic objectives, especially when those proposals are often addressing very different research questions and topics. So again, we spent a lot of time in our first workshop on problem structuring. This was delivered entirely online with participants building these cognitive sort of causal maps and then using the exploration of the connections between their own goals and projects they were discussing and one another's goals. And from this, we developed a set of objectives and sub-objectives for evaluation purposes. We then came back together in workshop 2, applying an evaluative framework that captured that information to a set of hypothetical proposals, which you can see on the slide here on the right, a quick little summary of them. Now, these were developed to be illustrative and diverse, not actual proposals under evaluation, but they were realistic enough to generate meaningful conversation. The Excel-based tool we developed by the UBC team was used here rather than AltaViz, as an example of how these data sovereignty questions can be resolved and how the principles of decision support can be implemented in different ways depending on needs and capacities. In this study, we observed that even when broad objectives were widely agreed upon, the process of actually exploring them using these methods helped to surface genuine differences in how people defined them and operationalize them in practice. And we found that using the framework helped participants to make their assumptions and priorities explicit. This has strong implications for shared learning from decisions and also for transparency. So knowing not just what someone prefers, but why they prefer it, this makes the decision process much more auditable, defendable, and improvable over time. So what did we learn from these two very different case studies? Structured decision-making brings different perspectives into direct dialogue. And this allows differences in assumptions and priorities to be visible and to be worked with. This can create something that's bigger than the sum of their parts. So convening different perspectives really matters, and doing it with guidance it really helps. We also observe similarities across the concerns and objectives between these two very different case study groups. These included a shared sensitivity to the importance of systems thinking and a shared acknowledgement of the tension between the urgency around reducing environmental impacts and the need to really insulate and protect safety and operational requirements. So these challenges, I think, are really at the heart of maritime shipping decision-making right now and across many or possibly all of the forms it takes. Now, onto the decision support itself, we emphasize here that the decision support tools don't provide an answer, and they are not designed to. But what they do is they help stakeholders to build a shared understanding of what matters, of what the trade-offs are, and what uncertainties are truly uncertain, and which uncertainties are important. So whatever decision is made is just more well thought out and transparent. I mean, essentially, if you think about it, like a process that produces consensus without surfacing disagreement or misunderstandings has probably missed something in general. That's sort of one of my rules of thumb. So with all that in mind, I'm taking you on a long trip here. What do you need to know if you want to integrate decision support into your process? Well, first of all, match the process to the decision, because not every decision requires the same level of analysis or the same investment of effort, and there are options out there for almost every type of decision. Second, invest in problem structuring. So different actors, even in the same organization, even with a lot of shared expertise, they're often operating with different assumptions, and the problem structuring can make this visible before it takes you in directions you may not be anticipating. Um, Particularly in this sector, I would say co-create solutions. I mean, this is often a best practice, of course, but I think in maritime shipping, experience is so important. So decision support professionals from outside the sector, they will really only be effective if they're leveraging existing knowledge within the field or co-creating their solutions. Also, we have here, using multiple criteria approaches. These are critical. Our report documents a wide range of objectives that marine shipping stakeholders consider really important, and these cannot be meaningfully separated from one another. So, multi-criteria approaches that can help to hold these dimensions together all at the same time are really needed. And then I think my favorite one, the one that really spoke to me during this study, was that we can build on systems thinking. We don't need to invent it here. So marine shipping professionals, I found, are already highly informed about the importance of holistic and systems thinking. Decision analysts don't need to convince the industry that systems thinking matters. It just needs to bring the methods and tools to make it useful, and so that they can operationalize what they already understand intuitively. And this is a significant asset and one that I think the sector is well positioned to benefit from in terms of its use of decision support. So with that introduction to our work, I'm looking forward to getting to the discussion phase. So I'll just quickly encourage you to explore our report and see the template that we're providing on the ClearSeas website as well. I do want to say one thing about it, though. It's a simple tool. So you should know that there are many more sophisticated and complex tools out there, depending on the scale of your problem. But this one is really just an opportunity to see that even a simple approach, a simple change can make a difference in multiple criteria decision making. And similarly, many of the tools we showcase in the report were chosen for their accessibility as well as for their analytic strengths. So if you do want to get more ambitious and complicated, there's a lot more out there to meet your needs, and you can, of course, email us if if you have questions about how to get started. Now, before I go and get into the discussion, I do just want to share one of my favorite quotes, this thought from Stephen Johnson's book, Farsighted. So this book is all about the decision sciences, and it's full of incredible stories of how decision analysis has, behind the scenes, shaped the world we live in. And in it, he points out, as you can read here, that the craft and science of decision making with far-sighted choices is strangely underappreciated. It's funny, we teach high schoolers lots of skills, but how to make difficult decisions isn't really on the curriculum, which is a strange gap given that good decision making can make us better at everything. Like so many, it's a success multiplier. So if nothing else, I hope you'll leave today with at least a curiosity about how the science of decision making can contribute to your own professional crafts in the maritime sector or elsewhere. And if there are any decision analysts here, I hope that you will walk away thinking about how you can serve this highly important and fascinating sector that just has the type of questions that we're trained to address.
Thank you, Simone.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll now move on to the panel discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll save audience questions until after the panel, but please do feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. So this panel will include Simone, who gave the presentation, and Simone Philpott, the postdoctoral research for the project and research lead, and then Amanda Jang, professor of engineering at the University of British Columbia and one of the PIs for the project. And then also Marie Chantal Ross, the director of the Ocean Program at National Research Council Canada, which was one of the project partners. So the first question is for Marie Chantal. This project began with the simple but ambitious question: how can we make better decisions about reducing the impacts of marine shipping? What gap did you see in existing decision-making approaches that motivated this research?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background. I've been working in marine shipping R&D for at least 15 years now, and I've essentially what I've seen are more and more complicated issues or more complex issues, and they typically get looked at one issue at a time. And so those balances or the trade-offs that Simone was talking about at the beginning, they're often not considered. And I worked at Transport Canada for a while, and I can't speak to how they do things now. I haven't been there for a good 10 years. But at the time, there were different groups that were looking at the different issues. So you would have a group looking at ballast water and a group looking at air emissions, and you would have a group looking at other like noise pollution or whatever. And from the research perspective, we had to look at all of them. And so as we were looking at them, I found that there was not a really good way for us. And I mean, it's gotten better over time, but at the time, the gap was that we had a hard time. It's not that there wasn't a good way. It's just that we didn't have the tools at our disposal to really figure out where the trade-offs would be. And so sometimes we may have been investing in a technology that may not have been what we needed. And I'm saying that because I don't have a specific, oh, we did this and we should have done that. That's not the case at all. In fact, all of the technologies that we invested in, like scrubbers, have found a way into ships and have made a positive difference in the way shipping has been done. But really what we needed as researchers in particular was a way that we could really understand those trade-offs, and that was systemic, so that we could have a process that we could rely on that would be a consistent approach to how to make those decisions. And so this project really does bring that together in how can we now go forward and make a decision on a specific research topic. And for the NRC specifically, we have lots of areas of interest. We're researchers, right? So we want to have that biggest bang for the buck that we possibly can. And that's something that we're looking forward to. And we have our own ways of doing it. So to find other ways that can potentially improve how we go about choosing our research projects is always going to be beneficial. And so that's kind of where it came from for us.
Great. Thank you, Marie Chantal. Yeah, that's a helpful way to set up the conversation. So Simone, I'll bring you in next. One of the most interesting findings is that there's often not a winner. Like, I think sometimes you think that this, a framework like this will sort of pop out a winner for you. And it's clear it's not that easy. So why is it so difficult from what you learned in the project to identify a single best pathway for reducing shipping impacts?
Oh, good, an easy one. Yeah, what makes it so difficult? Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit from decision sciences perspective, which is it's different. It's difficult in all the ways that complicate decision making for people. I mean, you're working with technologies and assets that are going through multiple systems, right? They're going through the atmospheric system, they're going through the water system, the social and economic systems. These systems are increasingly, I always have been, but are increasingly tightly coupled. Changes are moving quickly. All of these things make it difficult for people to hold everything in their head that they need to at once, right? But also just not even just the decision-making capacity, there's also just the fact that these systems experience impacts in different ways. So again, that scrubber example, something that is going to be helpful in one system, there's no guarantee that it's going to be helpful in another system. It's going to have trade-offs for another system. And when you have an entire portfolio of technologies to choose from, and then when you have multiple systems that you're trying to insulate from harm or trying to benefit from, in a complex system, it's going to get complicated. There's no way around that. So let's say it's difficult in almost every way in terms of trade-offs that we talked about, in terms of the fact that some of the impacts work on different timelines. So while one fuel might have reduced sulfur, reduced carbon, it might have, we're all sure, like methane leak, right? That works at a different timeline as well as a different intensity. Holding all that not only in our heads, but in our decision-making structures in terms of what we care about and what we can handle, very difficult. So I guess to shorten up, it's difficult on a physical scale. The physics is difficult, but also the fact that human brains do grapple with timescale issues when they're making decisions, as well as holding everything in the head. And that's why we use structured support, because people are really good at using sort of heuristics, like habits of thinking. We're good at getting to good enough a lot of the time, even without support. But these decisions have impacts where good enough isn't always good enough. And that's why we try to amplify the success by bringing in these more effortful, but also highly impactful methods. So I'll stop
Great.
there. You can come back
Yeah,
to
thank you so much. So next I'm going to turn to Amanda. So the project looked beyond greenhouse gas emissions, which I think we found is something that is often a focus and should be, but it's important to consider a broader range of environmental and social impacts. So what are some of the important considerations that risk being overlooked when decisions focus on a single metric?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might just start with the example that Simone shared previously with the scrubbers, that sometimes when we're focusing exclusively on one metric, we might not actually be reducing risks or impacts, but actually just shifting them into another domain. So we're taking air pollution and turning it into water pollution. And unfortunately, I think because of the way that many of our organizations are siloed, it might actually encourage that kind of thinking where it's like, okay, great, not my problem anymore. Maybe it's someone else's. But I think another consideration that came up through our case studies is that if you focus on a single metric, you might also overlook some really influential barriers that will affect successful implementation that need to be taken into account for planning. So for instance, even if your decision mandate is really driven by one key objective, it might be really important to understand these unexpected implementation barriers. So for instance, if we want to transition towards lower carbon fuels, it's also really important to consider operational constraints, for instance, for fuel storage and transportation. And so when we take that more systems perspective, even if you are focusing on that one objective, you might think about, for instance, what is the sequencing of actions that would support successful implementation? Like what are the enabling investments for worker and community safety or indigenous marine uses, or that would support successful implementation? Maybe the last thing I'll just say is that even when we're talking about a single objective, often there might be multiple metrics for that objective. So I think greenhouse gas emissions is a really good example, one where formerly the IMO, the International Marine Organization, was used a tank to wake greenhouse gas metric, which kind of focuses on like the greenhouse gas emissions during vessel operation. But more recently, it actually shifted this metric to take into account the complete life cycle of those fuels and change the metric for carbon intensity. So again, both of these are metrics for greenhouse gas emissions, but those different metrics for greenhouse gas emissions and carbon intensity actually can lead to really different decisions. So again, even with a single objective, there can be a lot of metrics.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So I have one more question for Marie Chantal specifically. I think you spoke a bit to this, but about why the NRC was interested in decisions. But what was it like having decision making itself be the research? And why is improving decision making an important area for research and innovation within the marine sector, both within NRC, but then more broadly?
Good question. Yeah, be obviously interested because we want to figure out the best way to go forward. But okay, so that aside, looking at decision support itself was a bit of a surprise to me. So I was like, how do we do it? But I wasn't thinking, because again, that's just not where I come from, right? Why would I look at the decision-making system itself? Because I was just like, we just need more criteria. I was thinking at it from, we do a call for proposals, and so we get these calls back. What should we be asking specifically for that call? Like that was my mindset, right? What kind of questions would we ask? We do that for things like GBI or like GBA plus analysis, or is there a transdisciplinary view? Like you have these really simple questions. So then when the solution came back to say, no, we're actually going to look at the decision-making process itself, that was like, oh. And I had to really, okay, how would I do that? Because even though I make decisions every day, I never really considered the process that I made it under. Like and I don't think a lot of us do. Like maybe it was just me, but I think that the research showed that we don't do that. So I know it's not just me. But what I really thought, I guess for me, what really struck me as important like really underlying all of the work we do is just how differently we all see this program. When we come to a project or problem or solution even. So when I have this idea within a very specific engineering environment and I say, well, we need to reduce emissions, I'm assuming everybody in that room agrees with me and has the same idea of what those emissions are. But when we brought people together to start asking what it was they saw, what the trade-offs were, we were actually seeing different views of what that problem and what those trade-offs were. So you were actually seeing where we all think we have one way of knowing. We actually saw that without the discussion, you fall into this trap of only one way of knowing, even when you think everybody is knowing the same thing. So for me, that just proved the point, because we hear about that a lot. And in how do we go forward again with multidisciplinary teams and transdisciplinary teams, and even with Indigenous engagement, which is becoming increasingly important in our research work. And so we're learning about these different ways of knowing, but it never occurred to me that those different ways of knowing would be happening within my own team, who were looking at specific issues that I thought we all agreed on. And so, yeah, going this approach just makes that world of difference. So you're actually getting all of the information, or as much information as you can, to make decisions that are nuanced and difficult and sometimes really expensive. So you want to really get those different views.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Thank you. So next, I have a question for all the panelists to reflect on. So a recurring theme throughout the project was uncertainty around future fuels, regulations, infrastructure, technology development. Do you have tips on how organizations should approach decision making in that uncertainty when so much remains unknown? So I'll start with maybe you, Amanda.
Another big question, Clara. So, I mean, one thing is we always try to have better foresight, but in cases of really deep uncertainty, which is what I think you're referring to, I think it's also important to think about strategies like robustness, which is something that came up a lot in this work. So what are decisions and investments that might perform well or well enough across many possible futures, but sometimes that means it might not be perform the best in any given future. Another thing that came up was design for flexibility and just better planned adaptation. So like planning to be flexible. So one example might be things like fuel flexible engines, right? Because we're not sure exactly, which fuels might end up being dominant or that there might be multiple fuels. And I think what that really requires though too is just this idea of planned adaptation, that you need to bake in these cycles of learning, changing, or learning, learning, changing iteratively. And that actually requires organizations to be more nimble and also sometimes change some of their operations to build in those adaptive learning cycles. So again, we want to have better foresight, but if we can't, we can at least plan for the fact that we don't know what the future will hold.
Great, thank you. Would you like to add to that, Marie-Chantal?
Yeah, I guess I agree. But also, I think, and going back to my last answer, really practically, I think these need to be thought of. And I'm looking at it from a research perspective. So I'm not looking at it from an operational perspective. They have a very different way of making decisions, or a different need than we do. But I think that in the way that we typically select projects or research themes has typically been siloed. And so it's a really good, I think it would be a really practical step to start looking at all of the different areas that a ship might be. Like, for example, right now if we're looking at clean air, right? We're looking at clean air, and then we tend to bring people around clean air. I think it would be good to have a bit of a brainstorming session before you even look at that, to say, bring the key players together and say, what are all of the issues? So what are the clean water issues? Is it noise? Is it ballast water? Is it plastic polluting or dumping, which is illegal, by the way, so don't do that. But what are these things? Is it gray water? Is there plastic in the gray water? Like who knows what all of the issues are? And to bring those together and then evaluate them based on how they affect clean air, so that you're looking at these trade-offs, and to do that early on so that you can be looking at a research theme that is, like Amanda was saying, maybe not the best solution for air ever, but one that has the least amount of negatives. And I'm going to say negatives just for a lack of a better word, but the one that has the most positive outcomes for as many of the different trade-offs as possible. And I haven't until recently done that. So I would like to adopt that into how we actually start looking at research projects.
Great, thanks. Timon, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think so. So I think part of your question was about how, like, advice for like making that transition, sorry, around the different alternative fuels amidst uncertainty. So is that yeah, okay. So I think some of my recommendations would be here. For one thing, we can't think of this as a sectoral approach, right? We have to find ways to implement this in very pragmatic scales, but in a way, it's really a whole of society approach, because otherwise you get caught in these chicken and egg problems with supply and with fuels that might be really great on vessels, but have different variable impacts on land and in the atmosphere. So this really is going to require an extensive effort and coordination. Coordination that isn't just from ports to communities, but also including the vessels in there, so that everyone knows the kinds of decisions and challenges that each group is facing, and can start to strategy plan around that. And that's a different kind of foresight, and it's one that's going to require again, different skills. It's not just modeling what's going to be happening in the atmosphere. It's going to be modeling how people are going to react to it. And so I think it's a skill set that's out there. I think the good news is, though, that in the maritime shipping industry, one thing that I've seen is that there is no lack of skills. We don't have a skill problem. We have a lot of creativity. There's a lot of ambition. So I think it's definitely a sector that's up to the challenge, and can be leading the way in that and setting great examples for other parts of society that are in energy transitions, that could look to how the professionals here engage with these tough challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a very dynamic and energetic sector. So to end the panel, I have one last question for all the panelists, and then we will move into the audience Q&A. So what is a key insight from this project that you hope decision makers, policymakers, researchers, industry leaders will take away and apply in their own work? Do you want to start, Marie Chantal?
Yeah, I guess I think that the thing that I would really like to see, particularly from policymakers, is just an understanding of how complex and nuanced it is to approach some of these issues. And as we go forward, we're looking at not just like Simone said, like we're looking at things that it's a system. We have ships that are a system themselves, that operate within a system of shipping, which operates within a system of transportation, and that transportation system has its own issues. And the more we go forward, the more we really have to look at what we're doing in that systems approach. And so for policymakers, I'm hoping that they'll take this and say, wow, we might want to consider adopting these in how we go forward in decision making writ large. For me, I'm interested in the research side, but I mean, writ large, how do we actually go about making decisions that affect so many people and that have so many nuanced, interconnected layers, and bringing it into a process as opposed to this is our one right solution. And I'm not saying that they don't do that now, but this gives it another layer of potential for creating better policies. And I say better, policies are good, but there's always room for improvement. Until we live in utopia, there's always room for improvement. And this, I think, is a good way forward in that.
Yes, thank you. Over to you, Amanda.
I might echo something that Marie Chantal raised earlier, which was just the importance of problem structuring in all of these processes and that deliberation and dialogue. Because it's in those encounters where we surface those different perspectives. And there are lots of great tools for kind of thinking about, how to optimize across multiple criteria and different sorts of things. But if you don't have not necessarily consensus, but at least clarity about like what is the problem, how do we measure success, it's really easy for things to kind of not really fit together later on. So again, the importance of that problem structuring and like deliberation being a key part of it, right? Because especially in a lot of these decisions we're talking about, it has to do with trade-offs and it has to do with values, and it's really hard. There's no mathematical equation for that part of it. It really requires people to come together.
Thanks, Amanda. We'll finish with Simone.
Yeah, so I guess a key insight that I would hope people walk away from reading the reports and from this talk would be, if you're in this industry and you're facing a lot of tough decisions and they seem really hard, well, that's not you. They really are. Like we've got a lot of documentation now showing how complex these are. And they are not just hard from again, cost benefit or trade-off analysis. They are hard in that they have all the qualities that make it hard for people and groups to make decisions around them. All the ones that decision scientists and psychologists have been studying for a long time. So paired with that, I would say there are fields and professionals and techniques that are there to support that. So, and I mean, the first decision support system was a pro and con list, and then they go all the way up to like things drawn on systems dynamics models, right? So there's a huge spectrum that you can draw upon. So you're not alone. You're not without support, and there's an entire field that's really well designed to help you with this.
Great, thank you. Well, that's the end of the panel. Thank you to Simone for presenting and to all of our panelists for that very interesting discussion. We now have time for audience questions. So we invite you to turn on your camera and microphones if you want to ask a question directly. You can use the raise hand function and I'll call on you if you want. You're also welcome to put questions in the chat and I can read those on your behalf. So to start off, I see there is one question in the chat from Lindsay Rogerson. To what extent are people bringing in all of the data needed on how the technology interacts with each system in order to properly weight impacts and outcomes of a new technology?
I'm going to answer that from a research perspective. And again, operationally, I can't. However, in research, what we do is, particularly now, is we try to get as much data as we can. And we are looking at all of the different aspects. As we become more and more aware of them, we do. We do not, here at the NRC at this point, have a database that tells you what these trade-offs are. But we are starting to understand what the outcomes are of our research in a more multidimensional way. In the OCEAN program, what we've done is a lot of multidisciplinary work. So while the NRC might be looking only at, let's say noise. So we do a lot of work in noise. So let's say we're looking at the noise issues. Then we will also work with a collaborator who's looking at how that noise affects mariners. And so now we're looking at mariner health versus noise. Well, we might not do it, that other team does. And so we have example after example of these collaborative projects where each person is grabbing the information that is relevant to them. So that's that siloed work we were talking about, and then sharing it at the research findings session. So that's how we do it in research. And again, we're just starting to understand these trade-offs and how do you actually use them in decision making. So hopefully in the next decade, we will have something that actually looks at some of the trade-offs that we're.
Thank you. Anything to add from Amanda or Simone?
Maybe just to build on that I think this process, the structured decision-making processes that someone was talking about are also helpful for identifying, yeah, where those data gaps might actually be. And I think that came out in Marie Chantal's example. So even if we don't currently have the data, this process kind of prompts that ask of like, okay, we need to look into this. Is this something we need to characterize better? So I think that is also a really useful outcome, identifying data needs.
Great. Simone, did you want to, or should we move on to the next question?
Oh, no, I think they covered it really well. Thanks.
Okay, great. I see that Eli has his hand up. Eli, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you guys very much. It was a great presentation. My question is kind of before industry has to make a decision, government has to make a decision. And when we look at some of the, the core thinkers of decision science, we see like Donella Meadows with, the rules or the goals are, different levels of intervention. So like setting stronger goals is a stronger intervention. And so my question is talking about that siloage and setting good goals from the government. That's obviously the ideal. How far away do you think that is? Like, do you think this is sort of an intermediate solution of decision making for industry? Or do you think it's kind of, sorry, one second. Do you think it's sort of an intermediate solution? Do you think it's long term? Do you think there's going to be like changes to the government to kind of allow for that cohesion that will support better policy from the government? Because obviously these policies, they are causing those trade-offs, and the goal would be, in my mind, to reduce the policies causing the trade-offs so that these decisions don't have to be made, if that makes sense.
I'm going to quickly say something because I'm not a policymaker and I do not create policies in any way, shape, or form. However, research like the one that was done here today, this what we saw here it ends up in the hands of people, particularly ClearSeas. I'm going to do a shout out for ClearSeas, who actually does sit in that interface between policy and research. And so this information gets into the minds of the people who make policies, and then they can use that in a way that, it hopefully they'll take on this, but basically this is exactly the types of things that we need to do to get that mentality into the minds of those people who make those decisions. So it's really ClearSeas. Go ClearSeas.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that a bit too. So that was a great example. You talk about Donella Meadows, and she's a system theorist, and sort of she talks a lot about how there's different types levels of interventions you can do, and one of them is like if you can intervene on goals and values, it's much more transformational. But the sort of other side of that coin is that as you get to these higher impact leverage points, they also get more challenging. Right? They get more inaccessible. So there seems to be this relationship between the most impact and inaccessibility that requires a lot more effort to get through. But it's a great way to look at the decision process, because you have to target where you can have impact, and you also have to target where your impact can be reached. Now, I just wanted to bring that up because I was really happy to hear you bring up that Meadows point, because I think it's super important. In terms of how to have these policies impacted, I would say by capturing these trade-offs. So the method we use, structured decision making, grew out of something called values-focused thinking, and it's a very specific part of decision sciences, and it has been used in many policy areas by like BC Hydro, and so it has a good track record in that. And so I do think that these methods do get picked up. They do get used. I'm not sure everywhere they get used, but they do have a lot of impact when they are used. I think that quote I gave at the end, I swear I don't know the author, so I'm not doing a plug for a friend or anything, but I'm just going to plug that book. If you're curious about the different ways that decision analysis has sort of interwoven to have a big impact in society, in terms of policy and also just major events. It goes through some incredible stories about where decision analysis was specifically implemented and made the difference between good and bad decisions across society. So I think its adoption is really important. I think it is there. Not everyone always tells you how they make decisions. I think it is being used in many places, but that it should be used in more places. I would say that organizing information and organizing dialogue is really important because they're tough challenges.
Thanks, Simone. So think we're at the end of the hour. Carrie, I know you have a question, so we will definitely stay and address that. But I just wanted to sort of conclude the webinar and thank our panelists for sharing their insights and contributing to this important project. And I'd also like to thank our project partners, the National Research Council of Canada and the University of British Columbia, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard for their participation in the case study. So as a reminder, today's session's been recorded and the recording will be shared with all registrants. So you should get that in your email. And also, if you have any questions about the project, please feel free to reach out to us. And I'm sure that Simone would be very happy to talk or any of the tools used, because we're happy to share more information on those. So with that, yeah, anyone who can stay to continue the conversation with Carrie's question, please do. So over to you, Carrie.
So I was wondering if the systems you tested are going to be used in all of those top priority projects that the federal government is now considering, or any of them. I'm particularly thinking about Churchill, Manitoba, which has some really important shipping elements to it. And I am writing an article for the Energy Mix, which is an online publication. So.
Sorry, so you're asking if they're using like structured decision making or these other tools in those evaluations? So
Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know if they are using them right now. I know that, again, as I mentioned, that the structured decision making specifically has been used in other major consequential decisions, like at BC Hydro. So it has a long history there. It has a great track record. Now, I find that in government decision making, often, again, we often ask what the decision will be rather than how the decision is being made. And maybe if we need to change that habit, right? So exactly what you're saying, will they be using these methods? I don't know if they will. I would think that I would personally, I would recommend that yes, these methods should be adopted for such consequential decisions, partly because they improve decision making, but also they improve transparency, and they allow people to know why you're making the decisions you're made, and they document it. So I think as a matter of good governance, personally, and I'm going much beyond the report right now, just to be frank here. I'm going into my own brain instead. I would recommend that they should be. I mean, maybe not structured decision making, maybe not the tools we used here, maybe not, not necessarily those ones, but something that captures the same essence of structured decision making, which is providing that transparency, providing that guidance, and providing accountability. There are other methods available, but structured decision making to me is the one that has a good track record already in Canada governance, and I would think so.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending the webinar.
Anyone else want to chip in on that?
Yeah.
I can't answer that question. I work on the research side, not on major project selection. So I don't have the knowledge to answer the question. I can't. So I'd love to, but I can't. I just can't. Yeah.
And Amanda, any input?
No, I think Simone did a good job covering.
It was a great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simone.
Yeah, she really did a great job. Okay, thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. We encourage you to stay connected with ClearSeas and continue the conversation. We've shared links to our newsletter, the project page, and our LinkedIn in the chat. So thank you for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye.